Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this WebEx event today. My name is Kevin Navratil, and I am the Democracy Commitment Coordinator at Moraine Valley. I'm also a political science professor. I wanted to start by discussing and kind of highlighting the work that has led up to today, the event that we have today. We have been collaborating with the Democracy Commitment in the One Book, One College program for the past year. And we've had about half a dozen events with about 12 different speakers. And I highly recommend watching these videos. They are available on the Moraine Valley Library YouTube channel. And just recently, the last month, we had an excellent talk by Dr. Troy Swanson looking at the power of beliefs and how that is a big impediment to addressing climate change policy. But there's been several events that are really relevant to this theme that we have been working on for the past year on misinformation, the rise of extremism, conspiracy theories, and the decline of truth and trust in the media. So I highly recommend that you check out those videos that are available on the Moraine Valley Library YouTube channel. So for today, I'm going to focus on the role that misperceptions play in subverting democracy and election integrity. So to begin with, I think it's important to provide some basic definitions that I'm going to be using today and what I mean by them. And a couple of them are straight from just Oxford Dictionary definitions, including the first one, and that is that misinformation, which is just false and inaccurate information, especially when it's intended to deliberately deceive. And then I wanted to talk about, we're going to be using the word misperceptions quite often. And there's a scholar, Brendan Nyan, who has defined misperceptions as a belief in claims that can be shown to be false. For example, that Osama bin Laden is still alive, or unsupported by convincing or systematic evidence. For example, that vaccines cause autism. And then lastly, I'm also going to use the concept of the big lie. Now, this goes back to Adolf Hitler. He wrote about this in Mein Kampf, this idea that a lie just so big, it can't possibly be distorted. And also has elements of a lie that pits one group of people against another group of people. And as you can see from the slide, Oxford Dictionary also defines it as a gross distortion or misrepresentation of facts, especially when used as a propaganda piece. So I'm not the first to make this connection, but I would like to explain how the 2020 election can be considered the idea that Donald Trump lost, or I'm sorry, that Donald Trump won, or that there was widespread fraud, or that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. All of this can be construed as the big lie. So basically, if you falsely believe that the 2020 election was stolen or won by Donald Trump, despite lacking any evidence, that can be construed as the big lie. Now, one of the leading historians who have looked at the rise of authoritative movements around the world, Timothy Snyder from Yale University, and shortly, I want to say this is about a week after the 2020 election, he brought up this idea of the big lie and how the idea that Biden didn't win the election is a big lie. And it's a big lie because you have to disbelieve all kinds of evidence to believe in it. It's a big lie because you have to believe a huge conspiracy to believe in it. And it's also a big lie because if you believe in it, it demands that you take radical action. So those are the basic definitions that I wanted to start with. And then I think it's important, I'm sure that there's many people who not only voted for Donald Trump, but perhaps believe in some of the claims of election fraud or that the election was rigged. And so I think it's important to point out how the 2020 election is the big lie because of the overwhelming evidence that the election was free and fair. We have a federal agency that oversees election security, and they found that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. There was no evidence of any voting system deleted or lost or changed votes. or in any way compromised. More recently, the Washington Post has done some excellent work, and they've identified at least 11 Trump advisors who indicated to former President Trump that there was no voter fraud. And I could provide many other examples if anybody wanted to talk about that later at the end of my talk. And I had indicated, by the way, in the chat that I'd be happy to take any questions and comments in the back half of the time that we have allotted today. So some potentially good news or bad news, perhaps in the eye of the beholder. There's a lot of evidence that citizens are not more misinformed than in the past. And I think that is surprising, perhaps to some people. But to others, we've had a huge revolution in information, access to information with the internet, and of course, higher education rates. The more Americans are, graduating from high school and attending college than ever before. So one example of this, just looking at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, they found that in a roughly 15-year time period, that the percentage of Americans who could correctly identify the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, had gone up to 56% in 2021 from 2006, where it was only 33%. And there's a lot of other examples like that. And again, one of our leading scholars, Brendan Nyan, who looks at misperceptions, has claimed and said that belief in claims that shown to be false although troubling, is no worse than, let me start over real quick. In general, no systematic evidence exists to demonstrate that the prevalence of misperceptions today, while worrisome, is any worse than in the past. So what is new? Well, I think there's a lot of elements that are new, but what I'm going to focus on today are really two trends. And one is the justification for new restrictive voting laws. I'm going to show a model in which I'm going to claim that elites, in particular, former President Donald Trump, really spread misinformation about election integrity, and then that influenced citizens to believe in election fraud, widespread election fraud, or that the election was rigged, or that the 2020 election outcome was incorrect. And so and then those misperceptions that citizens hold, those inaccurate views on the 2020 election, then are used as justification for new restrictive voting laws. So I'm going to explain that more throughout the rest of my talk. But the other major trend, I think, and the reason I'm going to focus so much on the 2020 election as the big lie, is just the total impact that it has had on our body politic. I think that not only is it changing views in election integrity, it has really pervaded our political system in a lot of other troubling ways. So that's the reason that I wanted to focus on this aspect for today's talk. So misinformation, misperceptions, and policymaking. I do want to give a little bit of disclaimers that Democrats or liberals, Republicans, conservatives, all have misperceptions and use or spread misinformation. It's a bipartisan phenomenon. As my original talk, I was going to give examples of how Republicans have used, based on misperceptions, have declared land a national heritage site in Montana. And Democrats, the misperceptions amongst Democrats have been used to pass legislation to require genetically modified food labeling, despite scientific evidence that shows for the last 25 years that genetically modified foods are safe. And I'd be happy to talk about those examples or others if there's interest in this. But I felt that it was prudent with the time that I had today to focus on what I see as the most nefarious and consequential trend that we have in our with misperceptions today, and that is the impact of subverting election integrity and the biggest threat facing the United States in the decline of election integrity. So I wanted to cite a couple of sources on this. There's many other people I could list, but Rick Hansen, who's at the University of California, Irvine, had mentioned that he's never been more scared about American democracy than he is right now. And then the Yale historian that I had cited earlier, Timothy Snyder, had basically said, and this is again right after the 2020 election, that it's right in front of our eyes. The most interesting and most distressing thing about American news coverage right now is that we don't treat the end of democracy as the story. That is the story. So that's the justification of why I'm going to focus on the role of the big lie and misinformation, misperceptions on the 2020 election as the focus of my talk today. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the trends that I think is prominent is the role of elites. And for today, I'll just focus on former President Trump, although there was many other elites as well, of many of the just long-term pattern of misinformation on elections, not just the 2020 election, but actually we could go back much further. And then the impact of that misinformation coming from the top then spreads to citizens, and citizens then have misperceptions or are misinformed about election integrity. And then state lawmakers are using the belief or inaccurate beliefs, the misperceptions amongst citizens on widespread election fraud as the justification for new restrictive voting laws. So I'll provide an example of this and go through this in more detail, but I just wanted to visualize this model, how elites start the misinformation, it spreads to citizens, and then the misperceptions amongst citizens are then cited as evidence and justification for new restrictive voting laws. So, role of elites. Now, obviously, the president in our political system receives the most attention. Former President Trump had, I think, around 80 million Twitter followers at one time. And going back about 100 years to Teddy Roosevelt, there's this concept in political science known as the bully pulpit, that presidents can hold events, give talks, give speeches, and try to raise awareness or persuade, move public opinion to support their agenda. And when they give speeches, the media is going to come and attend the event and cover it, and then that speech is just going to gain more attention. So clearly, that's something that President Trump had and gave a lot of speeches, got a lot of attention. Arguably, there's a lot of evidence that he's had more attention in the media than any of his peers before him that were president. So what I wanted to try to make clear is that this isn't just a few statements that he made. President Trump had been priming the audience on election fraud and questioning the election being rigged for years, and it was a consistent pattern that I'll make a case for here in just a minute. But to just highlight the role of elites that they play, this is Donald Trump's actual former national security advisor, John Bolton, who had stated that every day that goes by, it's clearer and clearer that there isn't any evidence. But if the Republican voters are only hearing Donald Trump's misrepresentation, it's not surprising that they believe it. It's critical for other Republican leaders to stand up and explain what actually happened. Donald Trump lost by any evidence we have so far was a free and fair election. So again, that just highlights the role that elites play, the critical role that elites play in shaping public opinion. And I just wanted to, in my going back through some of these statements, I kind of forgot about some of these, but just wanted to put this out there and ask the audience, what year, when did Donald Trump tweet the following statements? The election's a total sham, a travesty. We are not a democracy. We can't let this happen. We should march on Washington and stop this travesty. Our nation is totally divided. Let's fight like hell and stop this great and disgusting injustice. The world is laughing at us. If any of you would like to use the chat to guess what year these statements were made, just take a brief time out and see if there's any responses. 2016. 2020, they do sound a lot like 2020, and I think that we could find very similar statements that were made from 2020. Those were actually from 2012. So let me go back to sharing my presentation. So all of those statements that are currently up on the screen are from the 2012 election, which was really a blowout election when President Obama won re-election. But if you want to go back and do a search, this is, I think, November 7th of 2012. So that's my point. This is a long-term pattern. And I originally was going to start here, but this is from 2016, a couple weeks before the 2016 election when he won the 2016 election. But he was already claiming before the election started that there's large-scale voter fraud, and urging Republican leaders to follow this. In fact, the Washington Post has a fact-checking site that you can use or check out, and I searched just for inaccurate, false claims that he made on the election. And the Washington Post goes from 2017, January of 2017 to January of 2021. So in a 4-year time period, he had 3,037 false or misleading statements. And some of those, many of those, 773 false claims were made in October 2020, 353 were in September 2020. So this was all before the 2020 election. And just to highlight the long-term pattern of Trump questioning whether he's going to accept election results and claiming elections are rigged, I want to go back to the third presidential debate from 2016, and I want to play this 2-minute clip with candidate Hillary Clinton and candidate Donald Trump.
It's so dishonest, and they poison the minds of the voters. But unfortunately for them, I think the voters are seeing through it. I think they're going to see through it. We'll find out on November 8th, but I think they're going to see through it. She shouldn't be allowed to. She's guilty of a very, very serious crime. She should not be allowed to run. And just in that respect, I say it's rigged, because she should never, Trish, she should never have been allowed to run for the presidency based on what she did. I say it's rigged, because she should never, Trish, she should never have been allowed to run for the presidency based on what she did with emails and so many other things. I will tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense.
Well, Chris, let me respond to that, because that's horrifying. Every time Donald thinks things are not going in his direction, he claims whatever it is rigged against him. The FBI conducted a year-long investigation into my emails. They concluded there was no case. He said the FBI was rigged. He lost the Iowa caucus. He lost the Wisconsin primary. He said the Republican primary was rigged against him. Then Trump University gets sued for fraud and racketeering. He claims the court system and the federal judge is rigged against him. There was even a time when he didn't get an Emmy for his TV program 3 years in a row, and he started tweeting that the Emmys were rigged.
Should have gotten it.
This is a mindset This is how Donald thinks. And it's funny, but it's also really troubling.
Okay.
You know, that is not the way our democracy works. We've been around for 240 years. We've had free and fair elections. We've accepted the outcomes when we may not have liked them. And that is what must be expected of anyone standing on a debate stage during a general election.
And I wanted to play that 2 minutes because I think this is a mindset, and that goes back, that was a 2016 election before it even happened. And, regardless of where you stand or what party you support, as candidate Clinton pointed out, that, peaceful transfer of power, something that happened for 240 years, is really a hallmark of democracy. And regardless of who you support, going forward in future elections, I think it's something that's universal, that you want the candidate who gets the most votes to win the election and to take office. So this should be a troubling trend regardless of where you stand politically. So, of course, that didn't end in 2016. I just wanted to select a couple more points in 2020, again, before the election actually happened, that the only way, Trump claims, the only way that this election could be taken away from us if it's a rigged election. So you can either win the election or it's going to be rigged. Those were essentially the two options with the 2020 election. And then after the election, this was nearly a year after, Trump had this statement that the real insurrection happened on November 3rd, the presidential election, not January 6th, which was a day of protesting. So, I could provide many other examples, but I think the case is made that clearly it started from elites. Now, in terms of media, I think my colleagues, Professor of Communications and Journalism, Lisa Couch, and information literacy librarian Tish Hayes, they did an excellent two-part series on the role of media. And again, that's available on the Moraine Valley YouTube channel. I urge you to check that out. I think they make a really compelling case of how there's declining truth and trust in media. But just looking at social media, in the first week after the election, 16 of the top 20 most popular Facebook posts were that featured election were false or misleading. There's other examples of how Twitter, this is an MIT study from 2018, that fake news travels 70% faster on Twitter than real news. And so, we could, and I could look at podcasts. There's another study on podcasts that I could be happy to talk more about, that 25% of all the podcasts from the time period when Biden accepted the Democratic nomination until January 6th, 25% of those had endorsed misleading electoral narratives. So there's certainly a lot of examples of how this percolated through the media. And I also wanted to point out another visual that I think is helpful. This is coming from computer scientist Kate Starbird. She's at the University of Washington. And she actually did an excellent presentation you can watch on YouTube on the role of participatory disinformation. And I wanted to show this because I think it's another good visual representation of how this essentially starts at the top with political elites and how it percolates down through the media ecosystem, how activists might retweet or share misleading information online, and then this how this really gets pervasively into the audience's mind, and then how the audience, now she makes a case on how participatory disinformation impacted the 2000 and the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And so she's kind of looking at this a little bit differently than I am, but it's the same kind of mindset as far as the way it starts at the top and the impact that it has all the way down for citizens' mindsets. So, of course, there's a lot of different examples one could cite, but just looking at the role of, or looking at the changes, particularly amongst Republicans, in the percentage of people who were confident that their vote was counted accurately. This is from Pew Research, November 2020. And as you can see, there's just a stark decline from 2016 to 2020 of Republicans who feel that their vote was accurately counted, a 40% decline. And there's also a lot of examples that I could cite to show that 2/3 or more of Republicans don't believe that Biden is the legitimate president. So this one is from AP NORC, where 65% of Republicans, but I'll show another one later on where it's as high as 78% of Republicans who don't think that Biden was legitimately elected. So I wanted to finally get to examples of how this model works in practice, of misperceptions being cited as evidence and justification for new restrictive voting laws. So the segment that I'm about to read to you is from this article, and this was really the motivator for me to get into this project in particular, A Perpetual Motion Machine, How Disinformation Drives Voting Laws. And this is from Maggie Astor of the New York Times from this last May. So this is a segment from that article. When State Representative Bobby Kaufman of Iowa spoke in February in support of restrictive voting bill he was sponsoring, he could not point to any problems with the November election that demonstrated a need for new rules. But many Iowans believed there had been problems, he said. And that was a reason enough to allow less early voting, shorten election day polling hours, put new limits on absentee balloting, and forbid counties to have more than one drop box. And so, be happy to show some of these states and the laws that they've passed. But again, it's just based on the misperceptions that citizens have that was originally fabricated from elites as the justification for these new restrictive voting laws. So the final segment of my talk, I just want to talk a little bit about how this matters. And I could spend a lot more time on this than I will, but I want to make about 7 to 8 points of why this matters. So as I've mentioned, just having trust in the outcome of elections is a hallmark of any democracy. And as I've previously pointed out, a significant number, a strong majority of Republicans don't believe that Biden won the 2020 election. And as I claimed earlier, this should matter regardless of which candidate or party you support. And of course, now we have many states that have passed really restrictive laws that could really hamper voter turnout. There's been states like Iowa Georgia, that makes it a crime to pass out food or water to those who are standing in long lines. And of course, some voting precincts have lines that can be hours long. So there's a lot of examples I could point to for those who are interested, just ask about it. And another significant trend that we've seen is that Donald Trump is playing this role of kind of kingmaker where he decides to endorse candidates. And what's been clear is he is endorsing candidates who support the big lie, and kind of filtering out, winnowing out, if you will, candidates that don't support the big lie, that believe that Biden legitimately won the 2020 election. And this is coming directly from his spokesperson, that of course they're going to notice when there's people fighting for the truth about the November election results. And I'm listing this as a separate factor, but it's very much related to the previous one. I just wanted to focus on Secretary of State races. In several of the key swing states, the states that are really going to decide the 2024 presidential election, the Secretary of State candidates, 10 of the 15 Republican Secretary of State candidates have essentially endorsed the big lie. So these are states like Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada. And now these are public officials who are going to have, a lot of power in making key decisions about the election process. So, potentially having key people in these positions who, support the big lie is a troubling trend and concern that we should have going forward. Another one that I could spend a lot of time on, there has just been a huge exodus of people leaving, professional, experienced election judges and election staff who have been working for years, decades or longer, who have received death threats because of all of these misperceptions about widespread election fraud and the big lie. And so there's real concern. One survey from Reed College, the Democracy Fund, found that about a sixth of all election officials that they surveyed plan to retire before the 2024 election. And again, there's just real concern that they are going to be replaced by more partisan individuals, perhaps individuals who are supporting of that big lie and kind of might put their thumb on the scale in future elections. And then this is another really troubling trend. This has happened in Arizona. There's still ongoing efforts for this happening at the state level, but legislation that's essentially taking the power away from elected officials such as county clerks, secretary of state, and granting it to more partisan bodies to make decisions, in large part because so many Republicans were upset about the way that the Secretary of State in Georgia and other states handled the 2020 election. And related to that, and this has been recently described as kind of the nuclear, or having a nuclear bomb type implications on our political system, this idea that independent state legislature doctrine, which holds that state legislatures, as granted by the U.S. Constitution, should really have exclusive control over the rules of choosing presidential candidates or presidential electors. So just the idea here is that, for example, in 2024, imagine a close battleground state like Georgia that was in 2020 decided by around 10 or 11,000 votes. The idea here being that the state legislature of Georgia could decide how to award their electoral votes instead of how the citizens actually voted in the state of Georgia. That's something that is to keep your eye on. That's a trend that we could see. There's likely going to be a Supreme Court case, and we know that 4 of the members of the Supreme Court have already endorsed this theory. And then last 2, they're just trends to overturn election results. Now, despite it being nearly 2 years since the 2020 election, there's literally, this is a March 1st article where Republicans in Wisconsin are still trying to decertify the election result. And this idea of decertifying election results is not without precedent. As you may remember, after the 2020 election, nearly 150 Republican members of House and Senate voted to decertify the 2020 election. And then lastly, one of our key tools to fight election fraud is known as an electronic system called the Electronic Registration and Information Center. It's a tool that's designed to fight voter fraud by sharing information between states when individuals pass away or when they might move. And we've already seen examples in states like Louisiana where based on these kind of the misinformation and misperceptions that states are trying to leave this interstate consortium to try to limit voter fraud. So the potential consequence is you have more voter fraud, which then might, of course, percolate back through the system and result in more restrictive voting laws in the future. So I think I've reached my halfway point, so I'm going to stop there with my presentation and stop sharing my video and see if there's any questions and comments that I could get to. One of the questions coming up about the status of local conversations in Illinois related to voting laws. I do know that there's been proposals. Let's see if I can pull this up. There's been proposals in Illinois amongst Republicans, but, and I do think that this is an important distinction to make, there's hundreds of proposals around the United States. I wanted to focus just on the actual bills that became a law. So in Illinois, there have been some discussions amongst Republicans to propose some of these restrictive voting laws, but I see very little chance. In fact, some states like Illinois have gone the other way and actually passed legislation to make voting easier. Now, these are trends that I can't speak to in the last year, but have been ongoing, where like same-day voter registration. So Illinois happens to be one of the states that's actually making it easier to vote. trying to get the full question here. Do I think that mistrust will get worse in the future? I really do. Um, you know, I focused on this topic for a reason because I think it has a way of influencing a lot of other topics. Um, I think that it's been a long-standing trend for, I think, the party out of power to believe in more conspiracy theories or misperceptions about the current administration. And we've seen that with Democrats when there's a Republican in power. And so I do think that I was trying to make that claim earlier. There's a scholar who looked at the Chicago Tribune and New York Times for over 100 years to look at letters to the editor, and found that there was a really consistent pattern of conspiracy belief in conspiracy theories for the past 100 years or more. So there's kind of this idea that it's fairly consistent that there's going to be mistrust. But what we've seen, I think, in the last 5, 10 years in particular, is that the percentage of Americans who have trust in major institutions, trust in government, trust in the election system, trust in the media, has declined significantly. And that's a real troubling trend, and one that it's hard for me off the top of my head to think of ways that we are going to kind of stop that trend and begin to kind of gain back trust. So I do think it's something that's going to get worse in the future. I have real concerns about future elections, in particular 2022, but in 2024 especially. There just seems to be too many scenarios where, you know, I think one of the reasons I spent so much time going back through almost a 10-year history of Donald Trump questioning elections is that um, it's going to result in that mindset that somehow if your candidate loses, and I could go back and you could even look at, in some cases in previous election years, that Democrats, when they lost in 2004, that their trust in the election outcome went down a little bit, nothing like we saw in the last year with Republicans. But I think that that's a real troubling trend, that you can think, well, if my candidate or party lost, it's just because of voter fraud. It's just because the election is rigged. Um, and I think there's real concerns when I brought up that independent judiciary or independent legislature theory. Imagine a scenario where a Democratic candidate in 2024 receives millions of more votes in the popular vote, wins the Electoral College on paper because they won the most votes in enough of the states for the Electoral College to be rewarded to them to get to the 270 vote threshold, but somehow the state legislatures of key battleground states where that are controlled by Republicans end up awarding their Electoral College votes for the losing candidate, if you will. And so imagine how Democrats might view trust in the system if that scenario unfolded. So I do have real concerns about this getting worse in the future. But the encouraging signs, and as I mentioned earlier, that Tish Hayes and Lisa Couch had done an excellent job of what we can do about it. And I think information literacy, and following traditional media, and checking our sources, and being more aware of what we share online. There's a lot of different activities that we can engage in. This isn't really my specialty, but the previous events that I mentioned would be helpful in improving our trust in our major institutions. Okay, give another minute if there's any other questions or comments.